Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. I have read those words enough times now that I no longer need the page in front of me. They are simply there, the way a building's load-bearing wall is there. You stop noticing it until you understand what it is actually holding up. The first time I encountered Matthew 11:28, I was sitting in a conference room in Tyson's Corner. A Christian non-profit had put together a presentation for a mixed-use development I was considering funding. Somebody on their team had included the verse at the bottom of a slide, in a slightly too large font, the kind of choice that tells you a designer made a decision without asking anyone. I read it, I noted it, my reaction was not reverence, it was something closer to a private, dry amusement mixed with a specific irritation I could not quite name at the time. Rest. The word sat in my mouth like an object I did not know what to do with. I thought the language sounded presumptuous. Not offensive, I was not the kind of man who looked for offense in other people's theology, but presumptuous, yes. The idea that a man could simply come to someone and receive rest seemed to me like a shortcut, a very well-marketed shortcut, but a shortcut. At that stage of my life, exhaustion was not a problem I was trying to solve. Exhaustion was technically evidence that I was doing my job. I wore it the way a contractor wears a hard hat. It meant I was on the site. It meant I had not walked away. I did not want rest. I wanted control. And because my mind works the way it works, I have a civil engineering degree and a master's in real estate finance from Georgetown, and that combination produces a particular kind of thinking, the kind that immediately breaks everything into structures and load paths and failure points. I did what I always did with something I could not use immediately. I categorized it. I filed Matthew 11:28 under persuasion, under emotional language designed for people who needed comfort. I told myself I understood why Christians valued Jesus psychologically, and that understanding became a way of keeping the verse at a useful distance. It became material. I could reference it in conversations. I could understand its appeal without being affected by it. That is a particular kind of intelligence I had spent my life developing. The ability to understand something completely without letting it touch you. That was not what the verse intended. I know that now. I did not know it then. And before I go any further, I want to tell you something. The important part of this story is not what Matthew 11:28 says. You can read those words in 30 seconds. The important part is what happened to me inside those words. If you can stay with me for the next several minutes, I want to tell you about the moment I heard that verse in a way I could not explain away, and why I can no longer read it the way I once did. I am 48 years old. I live in Northern Virginia, outside of Washington. I have built a real estate development company over roughly 2 decades. We do luxury residential, commercial mixed use, some community redevelopment. My home has glass walls along the back, a long hallway that always seems to echo slightly more than it should, a kitchen that the staff uses more frequently than my family does, and a study that overlooks the garden on the east side of the property. The garden is well maintained. I pay someone to maintain it. I do not garden. I have never gardened. The garden exists because my wife mentioned once, years ago, that she liked the idea of one, and I had one installed within 3 weeks. That is technically how I solve most things. Quickly, efficiently, and without asking many follow-up questions. People call me when they need something solved. I have known this about myself for a long time, and I have always considered it a strength. Being needed gives you a kind of security that is very difficult to describe to someone who has never organized their life around it. Every call, every request, every problem handed to me was in some way confirmation that I was still necessary, still relevant, still on the right side of something I could not name. I have employees who know my schedule better than my family does. I have multiple properties. I have connections in this city that took 20 years to build. From the outside, my life looks like the result of discipline and intelligence and hard work, and it is all 3 of those things. I do not want to be dishonest about that. I worked extremely hard to build what I have. But if you are listening to this from another country, or from a city very different from Northern Virginia, and I know that some of you are, because people in completely different places have told me they recognize something in this kind of story, then you may already understand something that took me a long time to see. A life can be full in every measurable way and still feel strangely hollow, in a way that has nothing to do with money. I moved through my own house with the occasional sensation that nobody in it actually knew me, not fully. I had created a version of myself that was very competent and very reliable, and that version had slowly replaced the original. I am Muslim. That is important context. My faith has always been part of the architecture of how I understand the world. I pray, I observe the important practices. I respect my parents' memory and the traditions I inherited. My spiritual life was not absent before this story begins, but my faith had become, if I am being precise, another structure I had built carefully and maintained faithfully without allowing it to become something that could examine me. I understood it. I did not want it to surprise me. My relationship with Christianity was intellectual and, I would say, arm's length but not hostile. I attended Christian business events when clients expected it. I donated to Christian charities when it aligned with a project. I respected individual Christians I knew personally. But I kept Christianity filed in the same drawer as other systems I understood from the outside. My primary objection was not emotional, it was structural. The Christian emphasis on needing a savior seemed to me like a framework built for people who had decided they could not manage on their own. And I had spent my entire life proving that I could manage on my own. The idea of admitting that my intelligence, my discipline, my money, my connections, that all of that was somehow insufficient, it did not make me angry. It just seemed, technically, like it described someone else. I want to tell you about my younger brother now, because you cannot understand what this story is actually about, without knowing that he existed. He died unexpectedly several years ago. I am not going to give you the details because they are not mine to give in this format, and because the details are not the point. The point is what happened to me after. I never publicly said the loss broke me. What I did instead was become more productive, more financially aggressive, more protective of the people around me. I started building wealth at a pace that surprised even my own team, and I told myself the reason was responsibility. I had people who depended on me. I had obligations. I had a family to secure. What I did not tell myself, what I did not allow myself to say in any interior sentence, was that I was trying to build a wall. I had this private logic that I ran through constantly. If I have enough money, I can handle any emergency. If I have enough influence, I can get people the right doctors, the right lawyers, the right outcomes. If I am always available, always capable, always the person who knows what to do, then nobody I love will ever suffer because I was not paying attention. Because I was not present. Because I failed them. I did not recognize that as grief. I called it responsibility. There is a version of grief that looks exactly like discipline from the outside, and I had perfected that version. The truth I have never spoken to anyone until very recently was this. After my brother died, I became secretly convinced that if I had been less obsessed with building, less focused on my own expansion, I would have noticed something. I would have been more present. I would have caught whatever it was that needed to be caught in time. I have no factual basis for that belief. My rational mind knows that. But the belief lived underneath the rational mind, in a place where logic does not reach easily, and it became the foundation of everything I built after. My wealth was, technically, constructed on the buried premise that I had failed the person I could not save, and I was spending the rest of my life making sure I never had to feel that again. There is an old brass key in the top drawer of my study. It sits on a thin piece of leather cord, knotted twice near the top. It belonged to my younger brother. It is from our childhood home. It is the only object from that period of my life that I have never allowed anyone else to touch. I am not a sentimental person. I do not keep things, but I have kept that key in that drawer, locked, for years, and I touch it sometimes without realizing I have reached for it. That key matters to the rest of this story. Now, the incidents. I am going to tell you about 3 encounters I had before anything clearly supernatural happened, because I think you need to understand the path that was being laid before I had any awareness that a path was being laid at all. The first involved a man named Michael Reeves. Michael was a contractor, a construction contractor, the kind of man who arrives on a site at 5 in the morning and knows more about what is happening in the walls of a building than any architect does. He was responsible for a substantial portion of a development I was running in Loudoun County. He was practical, experienced, not the kind of person who makes speeches, but he was also very openly Christian in the way that actually functional people are sometimes Christian, quietly, through ordinary behavior rather than vocabulary. I had noticed small things. He would occasionally pause before a difficult decision in a way that looked like he was doing something interior. He kept a small printed card on the dashboard of his truck with a verse on it. I never asked which one. And he had this characteristic that I found professionally interesting, which was that he would not lie about safety issues. Not even when lying would have been financially advantageous. Most people, when you understand the levers, will eventually locate their compromise. Michael appeared not to have one. I had discovered a financial problem in Michael's company, not a fabricated problem, a real one. But I had prepared a negotiation around it that was designed to move him into a significantly worse contractual position than he currently held. I had done this kind of thing before. I went into that meeting confident in the way I was always confident when I had already anticipated every possible response. I had the structure of the whole conversation mapped before I sat down. Michael refused to sign. I pressed him. I explained what his alternatives were, which were not attractive. He listened. Then he said, calmly, that he could not sign something he knew would compromise the safety of his workers. I asked him whether his faith was really worth losing his company over. He looked at me for a moment before he answered. He said losing the company would hurt, but becoming a man who knowingly put his workers at risk would hurt more. I told him that principles were easier to maintain when someone else was paying the bills. He looked hurt by that. He did not retaliate. He simply looked hurt, the way an honest person looks hurt, and the meeting ended without the agreement I had expected to walk away with. I was not angry walking out. I was satisfied. I had demonstrated, at least to myself, the difference between idealism and practical reality. I considered myself the adult in the room. I walked through the building lobby feeling, if anything, confirmed in my understanding of how the world actually worked. There was a temporary safety board near the elevator, inspection notices, various posted materials. One of the employees had taped a small card to the corner of the board. It had a Bible verse on it. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. I registered the words for perhaps 2 seconds. I noted the mild irony of the timing, and then I continued walking. By the time I reached my car, I had stopped thinking about it. The second incident involved a woman named Elena Brooks. Her family was facing displacement because of a redevelopment project my company was managing in a neighborhood that had needed significant capital investment for years. Elena was not wealthy. She had no political connections that I was aware of. Her faith was not something she performed. It was more like something she simply had, the way some people have a posture that does not change regardless of what room they are standing in. My legal team had told me the property could be acquired through a settlement. I decided to handle it personally. I prepared an offer that was significantly above market value. My assumption, which I held with genuine confidence, was that people have principles until principles become expensive. I met Elena at the property. She listened to the offer. She did not immediately respond. I explained the numbers. I explained what her situation would look like with and without the settlement. She asked, very calmly, whether there was any way to adjust the project to preserve the community garden attached to the neighborhood. I explained the cost of doing that, which was substantial. She said she understood. She still refused. I became impatient. I told her I was offering her an opportunity that most people would accept without hesitation. She said she was grateful, but could not sell something that belonged to an entire community, not to herself alone. Then she said she had prayed about it. I asked whether prayer was supposed to change property law. She thought for a moment before she answered. She said prayer had not changed property law. What it had changed was what she was willing to become in order to get what she wanted. I drove back to my office with a particular kind of irritation that was uncomfortable because it had no rational surface to attach to. Elena was not naive. She understood exactly what she was giving up. I could not file her away as foolish, because she clearly was not foolish. She had simply decided that there were things more important than the settlement, and she had done it without raising her voice. Her refusal bothered me for days. When I arrived at my office that afternoon, a document was still open on the conference room screen. Someone had been working and left it visible. At the top of the document, before the project notes began, was a verse. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. My immediate thought was that whoever left the screen on was being dramatic. I closed it and moved on. The third encounter was with a man named Thomas Hale. Thomas led a church connected to one of my community redevelopment projects. He was observant in the way that certain people are observant, not intrusively, but with the quality of someone who notices things others have stopped looking for. I attended a community dinner associated with the project. My intention was straightforward: make the donation, receive the appropriate recognition, shake the necessary hands, leave within 90 minutes. I was prepared for gratitude, and I was prepared for brief speeches. I was not prepared for a personal question. Thomas thanked me for the donation. He meant it, which I appreciated. Then he asked me why I worked so hard. I gave him the expected answer: family, employees, community, responsibility. He nodded. Then he asked, "And if nobody needed anything from you?" I laughed. I called it a philosophical question. He did not push it. He let it sit there between us and moved on to other guests. Later, as I was leaving, he found me near the door and said something that I immediately disliked. He said, "You don't have to carry everything just because you're strong enough to carry it." I told myself on the drive home that Thomas was projecting. That pastors develop a habit of offering certain kinds of observations because they have found those observations tend to land on something, the way a wide net will catch something eventually if you cast it broadly enough. It did not mean he had seen anything specific, but the sentence followed me home anyway. In the elevator at my office the following morning, there was a Bible sitting on a side chair. It belonged to one of my employees. It was open. I glanced at it without intending to read it. Psalm 55:22. Cast thy burden upon the Lord, and he shall sustain thee. He shall never suffer the righteous to be moved. I closed the Bible and set it flat on the chair. This time the repetition bothered me in a way the previous two had not. I told myself that I was simply becoming more alert to Christian verses because I had been encountering them more frequently. Confirmation bias. Pattern recognition doing what it always does when a category becomes active. The human mind seeks patterns even where none exist. This was not complicated. Several days passed. Normal days. Meetings, calls, decisions, numbers. Then I was reviewing notes one evening and I remembered the verses. I opened a blank page on my tablet and I wrote them down in the order they had appeared. Matthew 5:9, Romans 12:21, Psalm 55:22. Then I added Matthew 11:28, the verse from the conference room years earlier. I felt slightly foolish doing this. I almost deleted the list. Instead, I looked at it. I asked myself what these verses actually had in common, and what I found was uncomfortable in a way I had not expected. Every single one of them described a form of surrender, peace instead of domination, good instead of retaliation, burden handed over instead of carried, rest instead of endless labor. These were not random spiritual sentiments. These were, point by point, precisely the things I had spent my adult life resisting. They addressed, with what I can only describe as uncomfortable specificity, the exact architecture of the identity I had built. I constructed explanations. I told myself I had simply been around Christians more than usual lately. The verses were common. The connections I was drawing were the result of an alert mind making associations from available data. Confirmation bias. Nothing supernatural required. The explanation held, for a while. Then, the following week, something appeared that I could not fit into the rational framework I had assembled. I arrived early at my office one morning. My study was locked. I unlocked it myself. I entered. On my desk, lying flat, printed on paper that I recognized as my own, from my own private printer, the one no one else has access to, was a single sheet with one verse on it. Matthew 11:28. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. I checked the printer logs immediately. There was no recorded print job. I reviewed the security footage. Nobody had entered the room before me. I eventually told myself the page had been printed at some earlier point and overlooked. I threw it away. I did not tell anyone. Several days later, I went to the locked drawer in my study. Inside was my brother's key, and wrapped around the leather cord was a narrow strip of paper with Psalm 55:22 printed on it. I became physically still in a way that is difficult to describe accurately. My mind immediately started working. Someone in the house had found the key. Someone had access to the drawer I thought was private. I questioned every member of the household staff individually. Nobody had touched the drawer. Nobody knew the key existed. Nobody knew what it meant. I locked the key away again. A few days after that, I stopped at a red light on my drive home. There was a delivery truck in front of me. On the back of the truck, as part of an advertisement for a local moving company, printed under the company name, was Romans 12:21. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. I looked up the company. I called them anonymously. The employee I spoke with told me the truck wrap had been done months earlier. It was not a current promotion. When I described what I had seen, there was a long pause before she said she was not sure what I was describing, because that verse was not part of their standard advertising. I sat in my study that evening with all 6 verses written out in front of me. I compared them. I looked at what they addressed together, as a set, and the pattern was no longer something I could honestly describe as coincidence. They were addressing 3 specific things in my life: my obsession with maintaining control, my refusal to release my burdens, my belief that strength meant never needing anything from anyone. I still did not call the pattern supernatural, but I could no longer call it meaningless. I had been an engineer long enough to know when a structure is telling you something about where the load is concentrated. I sat at my desk and I did something I had not done in decades. I simply stopped trying to solve what was in front of me. My breathing changed, my jaw unclenched, my hands went still on the desk. For several minutes I did nothing. I analyzed nothing. I reached for no conclusion. This was, technically, one of the most difficult things I had done in recent memory. After that evening, I started reading the Gospel of John, not as a believer, as an investigator. I read slowly. I took notes. I was looking for contradictions. I wanted something I could use to close this whole inquiry down and return to the normal operation of my life. Then I reached John 14:6. Jesus saith unto him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father, but by me. I read it again, then again. I searched for a less direct interpretation. I read the surrounding chapter to see whether the context changed the claim. I looked up commentaries. The specificity did not soften. Jesus was not offering advice or a framework or a useful way of thinking. He was making himself the answer, the entire answer, the only answer. I became frustrated. I wanted the verse to become an abstract theological statement, the kind I could understand at an intellectual distance and then file appropriately. It refused to become abstract for me. What it did instead was strike the exact wound I had been organizing my life around for years. I had spent decades believing I was the person who finds the way. I solve the problem. I build the road. I open the door. I create the exit. I am the person other people call when they cannot find a route through something. That was not vanity. That was my identity at its core. And Jesus, in that one sentence, was addressing that identity directly. He was saying, with what I can only call a very uncomfortable specificity, that the thing I had made myself the provider of, the way through, was something I did not actually possess. If Jesus was telling the truth, then the most important thing I had spent my life protecting, my independence, my sufficiency, my absolute refusal to need anyone, was precisely what I would have to release. I was sitting alone in the study. Afternoon light was coming through the windows at a low angle. My phone was face down. The house was quiet in the way it gets on certain afternoons when the staff have finished for the day. My brother's key was beside my notes on the desk. I was not touching it. I did not cry. I did not kneel. I did not pray. I did not call my wife. I did not announce anything to anyone. What I did was open the locked drawer. I took out the brass key, and instead of putting it back where it had lived for years, separate, locked away, in a compartment I had kept far from everything else, I placed it directly beside the Bible. I am aware that to someone watching from the outside, that looks like a very small action. It was not. For me, placing that key beside that Bible was the equivalent of admitting that the grief and the faith could occupy the same space, that I did not have to keep them apart in order to maintain the structure I had built. That is the closest I have come in the physical world to saying something I have never been able to say out loud. After that, I left the study and walked into the main hallway. It was late afternoon. The tall windows facing the front drive were letting in the last of the warm light. Everything was quiet. I was walking toward the front of the house without any particular destination. The doorbell rang. I opened the door. A man was standing outside. He appeared ordinary, middle-aged, weathered clothing, nothing conspicuous, no obvious reason for my body to respond the way it responded. But it did. Before I understood what was happening, before I had formed any conscious thought about the man at all, my fingers went numb, not gradually, all at once. The glass I was holding slipped against my palm and struck the floor and shattered, and I did not bend down to pick it up. My legs tightened. I could not move my feet. The people around me, there were no people around me. The house was empty, and yet the sensation was of being the only person in a room full of movement who cannot move. The man asked whether I was the owner of the house. I said yes. I heard my own voice from somewhere that felt slightly removed from where I was standing. He said he needed somewhere to sit for a moment. My instinct was to close the door. That is always my instinct. Strangers with needs are problems I can choose not to inherit. I have spent my life making that calculation. But something about his presence, not his appearance, something underneath the appearance, made closing the door impossible. He was looking at the brass key, not at my face, at the key that was still in my hand because I had carried it from the study without thinking. The atmosphere changed. I cannot tell you exactly when, because I am not certain it happened in the kind of sequence I could mark on a timeline. There was no thunder, no light that did not belong to the afternoon, no sound that came from anywhere other than the ordinary world. What changed was the quality of the silence. And then there was a voice. Quiet. The difference was not volume. The difference was that I understood, in a way I cannot reduce to a logical explanation, that I was being addressed, not spoken to, addressed. The words were, "You have spent your whole life trying to carry what I never asked you to carry." Matthew 11:28 came back to me immediately. I understood that these words were connected to the verse, were perhaps the inside of the verse, the meaning beneath the language I had spent years treating as material. But the voice continued, "Your brother was not a debt you were born to repay." I want to be precise about what happened inside me when I heard that sentence. It was not that I felt moved in the way someone feels moved by a beautiful piece of music or a meaningful film. It was more specific than that. It was the sensation of a structural wall being removed from a building you have lived inside your entire life, and suddenly being able to see how the load had been distributed. The secret I had never spoken to anyone, not to my wife, not to my closest friends, not to any person who has ever known me, was in that sentence. The belief that my brother's death was evidence of a failure I could spend the rest of my life making up for. Nobody had that information. It did not exist anywhere outside my own interior. The voice said, "You built a life around the fear that loving people meant controlling whether they lived or died." I could not answer. What I recognized in that sentence was not an accusation. It was simply a description of my life that was more accurate than anything I had ever been willing to say about myself. The entire structure, the work, the money, the connections, the problems solved, the being needed, it had never been about security. It had been about guilt. It had been about making myself so indispensable that the universe would not be able to afford to let the people I loved be taken from me. I tried to speak. My first sentence failed. I started again. I said, "If you are really Jesus, then you already know why I can't let this go." The answer came without pause, without anger, without the kind of explanatory tone I might have used if I were trying to persuade someone. 2 words, "I know." That was the moment. Not a theological argument. Not a demonstration of power. Not an answer to the question of why my brother died or why I had been living the way I had lived. Just 2 words that meant, I was there. I saw. Nothing you were carrying was hidden. In my entire adult life, I had never been in a room with someone who knew the thing I had been carrying and chose to stay anyway. Not because I hadn't told anyone, but because I had made certain no one ever got close enough to the drawer where I kept it. I had protected that drawer with money and competence and constant motion, and an identity so well constructed that nobody thought to look for what was underneath it. He knew, and he was still there. My resistance did not break the way glass breaks. It did not shatter all at once. It was more like the moment a structure begins to shift, slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, and then you realize the whole load is moving in a direction it has not moved before. I understood, standing there, that my brother's death was not a debt, that the life I had spent building control had not been protecting the people I loved. it had been protecting me from the feeling of powerlessness. That Jesus was not asking me to become weak. He was asking me to stop pretending that carrying everything alone was the same thing as strength. At some point, the voice stopped. I looked at the doorway. The man was not there. I am not going to describe what that was like with more drama than it deserves. One moment I was looking at him. The next, the doorway was empty. The afternoon light was the same. The broken glass was on the floor. The brass key was in my hand. John 14:6 was still in my mind, and now Matthew 11:28 was there beside it. And the words that had always sounded to me like a psychological comfort mechanism for tired people now sounded like something else entirely. They sounded like an invitation issued to a very specific person who had spent a very long time being too proud to accept it. I went back to the verses in the days that followed. All of them. Michael Reeves and Matthew 5:9, the peacemakers. I understood now that the meeting I had walked out of feeling like the adult in the room was not a demonstration of my superior understanding of reality. It was a portrait of the kind of man I was becoming while I won. Michael had held something that I had confused for weakness, and that was, technically, a form of integrity I did not have. Elena Brooks and Romans 12:21. I had believed, genuinely believed, that every problem had a price, and that the only question was finding it. Elena had shown me that good was not something you purchased through sufficient strategic pressure. It was something you chose at a cost you paid yourself. Thomas Hale and Psalm 55:22. Cast thy burden. The verse that had been wrapped around my brother's key. I had spent years carrying that grief, because somewhere inside me, I believed that releasing it would mean I had not loved him enough, that the weight was the evidence of the love. I now understood that releasing a burden does not erase the love that was attached to it. The love remains. The crushing is what you let go of. And Matthew 11:28, the verse I had treated as material, the verse I had filed away as psychological comfort for people who had stopped trying. The verse I had used, if I am being honest, as a way to explain Christians to myself so that I could maintain the comfortable position of understanding them from the outside without being required to consider whether any of it was actually true. Before, a promise I had categorized as emotional language. Now, an invitation, a direct one, aimed at me, at the specific part of me that had made exhaustion into an identity, and productivity into a wall, and grief into an engine, that I ran at full speed for years, without ever looking at what was powering it. The irony I have to sit with is this. I spent years studying that verse. I used it in professional contexts. I understood its rhetorical structure and its emotional appeal and the psychological need it was designed to meet. I was an expert on Matthew 11:28 as a piece of material, and the entire time I was a man who could not rest, who had turned the inability to rest into proof that he was carrying his responsibilities correctly. I was, in a very specific and slightly embarrassing way, the exact person the verse was describing, studying the verse from the outside. The verse did not need to chase me. It did not need to force anything. It remained exactly what it was, while I built an entire life around refusing what it was offering. That is one of the final thoughts I keep returning to. The words did not change. I did. After the encounter, I began attending a small non-denominational church. The emphasis there is on scripture, on prayer, on sitting with what you find, rather than immediately converting it into something you can use. I am still learning that last part. My relationship with my wife changed first, and most visibly. She had always known that I would solve any practical problem she brought to me. What she had not known was whether I would sit with her through an emotional one without immediately converting her feelings into an action plan. The first time I told her I did not know what to do, genuinely told her, without following it immediately with 3 contingency plans, she was quiet for a moment. Then she sat beside me. She did not fix it. I did not need her to fix it. I needed someone to remain in the room with me while I was afraid, and she did that, and it was one of the most significant things that has happened in our marriage. I told her about my brother. Not the facts of his death, which she already knew, the secret underneath, the belief I had carried for years that I had failed him, that I had been too absorbed in building to notice what needed to be noticed. She told me she had never known I was carrying that. She had always thought I had processed the loss and moved forward. She had seen the increased productivity and taken it for strength, which is exactly what I had intended her to see. She asked me once, when I told her about the encounter, "Did you know things about your brother that nobody else could know?" I told her yes. She said she had never heard me speak about anything with that kind of certainty. I still struggle with control. I want to be clear about that, because I think it would be dishonest to describe a transformation that sounds cleaner than it is. When someone I love is sick, my first instinct is still to start researching, calling doctors, building a list of options. The difference now is that I can recognize what is happening inside me while I'm doing it. I can stop. I can pray. I can sit with the fear instead of immediately converting it into a project. That is not a small difference, even if it does not look dramatic from the outside. There is still one question I carry, which is why Jesus chose to meet me through such a personal encounter rather than simply leading me through scripture in the ordinary way. I don't have a complete answer to that. I have stopped demanding one. I have learned, slowly and with some difficulty, that some things are understood only after you stop requiring that the understanding arrive before the surrender. I want to ask you something before I go back to the verse we started with. If you are the kind of person who looks successful from every visible angle and privately carries something you have never told anyone, not a failure anyone else knows about, but the specific quiet guilt underneath your own life, the thing you have organized your strength around, the loss you turned into an engine, I want to ask you to let someone pray for that. Not for your outward situation, for the courage to stop carrying what you were never meant to carry. I know what it costs to keep that private. I know how carefully you have constructed the version of yourself that makes it invisible. I am asking someone who knows you to pray that you find what I eventually found in those two words. Not an explanation, not a solution, just the presence of someone who already knows what is in the drawer and has not left the doorstep. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. I read that slowly now, not for dramatic effect, because every word carries something it did not carry before. Come unto me. That no longer sounds presumptuous to me. It sounds like someone who knows your address. All ye that labor. I spent years believing that described someone else. The tired ones, the ones who had stopped trying. I understand now that it described me specifically, because labor in the way this verse means it is not effort. It is effort that has become a substitute for trust, heavy laden. I know exactly what my burden weighed. I know how long I carried it. I know what I built on top of it to avoid feeling the weight. I will give you rest. I spent years reading that as an escape from responsibility. It is not that. It is freedom from the belief that I must control everything in order to deserve love. Those are very different things, and for a very long time I could not see the difference. The first time I encountered this verse, I protected myself from it by turning it into an object I could analyze. I became an expert on it as a piece of material. The verse lost nothing because of what I did with it. It waited. It remained exactly what it was. The words did not change. I came back to that one word at the end, come. All my life I had assumed that whatever God was, whatever relationship was possible, with whatever was ultimate and real, it would require me to become sufficient first. To fix myself, to earn the approach, to climb far enough to be worth addressing. The invitation begins with a different movement entirely. Not prove yourself, not fix yourself, not become worthy, just come. My brother's key is still in my study. It sits beside my Bible now, not in the drawer. Not locked away in the compartment I kept it in for years, separate from everything else. It sits in the open, beside the words I once treated as material, and now read as something I am still learning to live inside of. The key has not changed. The Bible has not changed. I have.